All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is Stacy Estep, and I'm the Literary Arts Director for Sundress Academy for the Arts. And on behalf of everyone at SAFTA, I want to thank you so much for joining us for the July installment of the Sundress Reading Series. Before I introduce our wonderful readers, I want to tell you all about this month's community partner. The Women LLC is an emerging nonprofit comprised of 6 Black women who see the economic challenges of Black business owners in Knoxville and are interested in expanding their small businesses while struggling with access for funding them. The Women LLC is dedicated to removing barriers to increase access to financing Black-owned small businesses through community funding, investment clubs, and crowdsourcing. And currently, the Women LLC is looking for folks willing to donate $5 per month to help provide microloans for area Black businesses. And for more information, you can find them online at their website, thewomenllcknoxville.org, or their Facebook page. And you can also go there to find out about other ways you can help support their mission. And we'll have all those links in the chat there so that you can donate very easily. And we'll also include a direct link to their PayPal as well. And speaking of the chat, it's also a great way for tonight's readers to point everybody to their newest collections and other places where people can find them online. So we will be adding those links there as well. And now let's introduce our readers. Next up, we will be hearing from Esteban Rodriguez. He is the author of the poetry collections Dusk and Dust, Crash Course, In Bloom, Displacement, and The Valley. His work has appeared in Boulevard, Shenandoah, The Rumpus, Tri-Quarterly, and elsewhere. He is the interviews editor for the Eco Theo Review, an assistant poetry editor for AGNI, and a regular reviews contributor for Pank and Heavy Feather Review. He lives with his family in Austin, Texas. Please welcome Esteban.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Really excited to be here. Thank you, Lexie, for that beautiful reading. I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. This first poem is from my collection, Dusk and Dust. It is titled Lucha Libre, and it is sort of the Mexican form of wrestling. I definitely wanted to be a wrestler, kind of like their WWE style. When I was younger, but I realized I didn't really have the stamina for it or the ability to put oil all over my body for extended periods of time. So I guess I became a writer. This one's Lucha Libre. It was the mask I wanted more than fame. The tight turquoise leather tied with red shoestring around my nape. The thought of being someone else without being anchored to a face. Not to face the features in the face that were slowly changing, growing stranger by the year. And there was a white complexion so different from the darker shades of skin around me. And the pimples unwilling to renounce their loyalty, leaving me to reinvent the candy red bumps as chicken pox instead. Even if I didn't know the one-hit wonder of this disease, once I saw those Mexican men fighting on TV, I couldn't care less if anyone else believed it. I, like them, was putting up a front because a front was the surest thing to guise myself in. My confidence further than their choreographed jumps, their lunges, plunges, angelic dives, and the tiptoe rope walking as they backflip farther into the ring. Sweaty bodies begin to sink with the crowd's shock and awe, feed off their praise and screams. And there I was, bouncing off my bed, mumbling Spanish I could barely speak, and hardly able to drop kick, eye poke, cross chop, pile drive, headbutt, body slam, brain bust, somersault, shoulder claw, slingshot, or sleeper hold my role as Rudo. Plain villain, desperate to pin the appearance I no longer wanted. To wait for the count and finish off with a headlock so I wouldn't have to take off my mask. To myself, who I knew I really was. This second poem is titled Por Amor. This collection came about because it's called In Bloom, but specifically because I had a bunch of leftover poems from this one, and I ended up assembling it and wrote a few more. I'm super glad to be sharing this with you all. But this one's titled In Bloom, and the genesis for this particular poem was that my wife and I have some really good friends, and they told us they're about to get married, and they asked us if I could write a poem for them, and I was like, I would definitely try. Love poems are not my thing. I titled it Por Amor, which is Spanish for love. Um, and I ended up starting to write about goats, and the poem became sort of about goats and about the relationship with the mother and father. There is a particular word illustrator, which is kind of like a method of castrating livestock that does show up here. So yeah, I guess like I'm fascinated with goats, but I guess I can't write a wedding poem to save my life. So what I'm what. Yesterday, I wanted to write of it. The field, the goats, the hope that every kid I turned over, their muddy, trembling legs locked in my palms, would just as soon forget how my father applied the illustrator. He'd whisper to himself, claim a language too mournful to understand what I assumed was acceptance, rest, or whatever feeling allowed him to move from the barn to the field to the house, then back out again. Watching the plains, the stars, the moon that proselytized the metaphor that caved the more I try to make it one. And the more I rendered my father a bruised and oversized silhouette, pacing the scarred terrain, and failing, no matter how long he walked, to ponder the details the next day. The struggle, the bleats, the sense that there was purpose to our grips, and that I, so apt to let my thoughts wander from scene to scene, wouldn't let myself think about nights when he swayed from the couch to his room, rubbed his half-defeated hands on my mother's waist, and tried, with the parts of him that bore the most weight, to move past the door, where he forced himself to conceive a new darkness, where he wouldn't have to face the light's judgments, wouldn't have to feel the brightness beg for his blurry flesh to return. I'm going to finish off with this poem, which is actually about 9 sections, but I'm only going to read about 5. This is the latest collection right here called Displacement. I'm super proud of this one. And the middle poem is titled Diaspora. And this one is dedicated to all those that have, will, and continue to cross into this country or into any country in order to make a better lives for themselves. Diaspora. 1. First, an exodus of sweat. Trails of salted rivulets crown like crucifixion thorns to your head. Each bead, larger with every breath, surrenders to gravity's custody. Migrates down your temples till it reaches the unshaven borders of your jaw. As the heat calcifies your already calcified skin, and the sugar your country exports remains pasted to your back, this perspiration drips onto the backside of your backpack-clenched hands and kisses the shadow of your feet, while the ground, still committed to its drought, clumps like soil once acquainted with the affection of rain. 2. Head hung, heavy, mute, you tread the barbed terrain without your shadow. Watch the castrated ground fossilize your tracks. Despite the measured length between each step, the horizon makes no distinction between what moves and doesn't. And the mirages yawning across the plains gnaw the floating cities equally from everyone's view. Behind you, thin and shadow-thirsty bodies with teenage faces. Middle-aged and ash-complexion men who, as they fall behind and attempt to remember their forged backstories and names, imagine factories where their hands will learn a language of meat and poultry, where this desert will bleed into a desert of parking lots, and where they'll wait all afternoon for pickup trucks, posture themselves in ways that will get them chosen. 3. Then decomposition. The moment when the sagebrush just above your body casts its shadow, and the shadow burrows through your clumps of branded fabric, through flattened limbs drained of muscles, cartilage. Night carry out their cycles, render everything stagnant. The scene begs for a wake of buzzards, for their cliched hovering, their descent on the blackened bones and bile, and their methodic picking of the heart in its ultimate metaphorical condition. But not every death translates into a preconceived notion of what death is. And instead, your body merely lies there, secreting its tissue back inside itself. Passing tumbleweeds to offer this image a sense of closure, or to add a symbolic element beyond the elements of exposure. That flesh coagulates into an object patrolmen stumble on, photograph, haul out and leave with a numbered tag hanging from your toes on a cold steel. 8. As dawn unscales the last scabs of darkness, miles upon half-lucid miles of Sawato appear before you, each with a handful of severed doll heads hanging from their arms. You move through this forest, study their faces, the porcelain chipped, cracked, and faded, deprived of the manufactured painted lips that once made it easy to mouth speeches to their jaws. You look down, notice pieces of your unemployed flesh slipping along your bones. And when clumps of your thighs and calves reach the ground, scuttle and hide in the nearest hole, you begin scooping the scalped and earless skulls, the tiny suits and dresses, the shoes that drift like flower petals from your hands as you descend into a valley of powdered carcasses, knotted hides, horns and pelvises, and spinal columns the earth, for reasons you'll never know, has kept perfectly intact. This is the last and final section. Thank you all for coming. You all listening. This is 9. From the far corner of your country, you survey the expired soil, heat-warped corrugated sheet metal meant to resemble the walls of houses, planks of uneven wood acting as rooftops, plastic clotheslines strung between them, and the half-clothed children stepping through puddles haloed with newborn mosquitoes. Along the foot-worn paths, you spot groups of seated women, bandaged in handmade sarapes, waiting for something they were certain some god had promised. The ocean smuggles in a band of swollen clouds, and you, like an amateur prophet, know the coming forecast will only tease the harvest, that the sun will again bruise another season. Left walking back to your village, picturing the frayed and nameless figure your body will soon become. Thank you all.
Amazing. Thank you, Esteban. Thank you so much. Our final reader this evening is Jung Chae. She is a Korean-American writer from New Jersey whose poetry and prose have appeared in AGNI, Calyx Journal, Crab Orchard Review, Plowshares, and elsewhere. Most recently, she won the 2019 Pushcart in Nonfiction and the 2019 Emerging Writers Contest in Nonfiction from Plowshares. Please welcome Jung.
Am I on? Hi, everyone. That was so beautiful. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me to read. Sundress and Aaron and Stacy. I wanted to read some poetry, but I don't have poetry tonight, so I guess I'll just stick to my prose. The piece I want to read from is from Pojangmatcha people. Pojangmatcha is a type of roadside drinking tent or eating tent that I grew up around in South Korea. in the 70s. They were just everywhere. I think they're still around. I know they're still around. It's a very popular kind of thing for place for people to congregate and socialize. And I think I was thinking about that and kind of reminiscing. And I guess it's a type of metaphor for the people that I've been thinking about. It appeared in Plowshares in winter 2020 edition. 포장마차 people. I'm thinking of the sad old men I knew, the salt on their drunken foreheads, a sorrow, of souls stained deep with glutamine and guilt. Oh, the beauty of MSG. I'm thinking of comfort, the kind rising out of the bodies of blood soups and strangers, of longing. Inside the tiny drinking tent, the haloed bodies of Haejanguk, the mother of all soups, the soup that chased away tremors and trauma and money troubles and time and time and more time, that soup. The bodies, the into the wee hour drinking bodies, the sitting with bottoms touching is just fine bodies, the bodies sweating out their failing livers, those bodies. Tired and failed as they were, huddled together inside this tiny domed cathedral, were their tiny lives, powered by a tiny light. The 1970s oppressive come underground guerrilla light, powering the dim city and its people and their small dreams, past the curfew. Oh, how holy was this light and this coterie, the men lurching headlong into this bloodbath of comfort, the group chasing away their daily hangovers and bad deeds, only to pass on their karmic debt to their only sons, pass down the bloody mess of their lives. How its biliary notes and fraternal bodies bosomed, not mocked, their chronic bad lives and livers. My father. I'm thinking of him, but not him, of souls cursed and caressed inside the pojangmachas, inside a village. No, not a village, but a nation full of sad, sad old men, with their jaundiced faces riddled with the pockmarks of post-war trauma, with their deadly breaths, who lower their sorry heads into group after group, who fawned over their women and children, even as they beat them senseless. The woman. I'm thinking of my dead grandmother and my mother, their mothers' mothers, the woman gathered at the hair salon next to my grandmother's house, the one with the outhouse. I'm thinking of a childhood lost to dreams, of dreams lost and found, scribbled on the walls of an outhouse, a shithole brimming with no good fathers and husbands and lovers and later of sons, and the woman who made them. Kind of long, so I'm gonna skip around a little bit. This is section 2. Spring. I'm thinking of the outskirts of cities, inside the skirts of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, generations of mothers. My grandmother. I'm thinking of Sunday mornings, those early morning screeches of cocks at the hands of the skilled butcher next to the liver shop where my grandmother sent me to fetch her a sliver of the freshest raw pig liver with a dash of sesame oil to help with her eyes. My grandmother, the man of the house, for all 3 generations of us women, girl women. What I remember are the smells, the complex smells of the open dirt roads against the tall sky, and the unnamed tree whose branches held softly the metamorphosing bodies of caterpillars that fell to their untimely deaths and landed on unsuspecting passersby beneath them. What I smell is the shit, the complexity of it, from inside the outhouse of my grandmother's house that lingered after a rain. I feel the tug of the angel whose hands plucked my small body from the abyss, that dark, creature-filled, all possibilities-filled, gaping hole that grabbed at me as I fell into it. Inside the giant dome that was the market, I see the rows of dead fish with their eyes wide open and eyeing back at me as I scurry past them. I hear the shrieks of the chickens being picked and primed and dumped into hot water tanks, all in one fell swoop. The cacophony of the black market vendors haggling or scuffling or cussing or whatever. I see the dirty looks of the old men glaring at my wee year-old self as I ran away from them. I feel the sweat coming down the foreheads of children, their little hands fastened tight to their mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, aunts, uncles, cousins. The children, with their honeysuckle-soaked fingernails, tiny but beautiful hands of girl children, of glands of children, packs of eager 6-year-olds chasing each other down muddy streets to the nearest hawker stands inside the tiny domed tents to fill their unfillable bellies. There, under a shaky parasol, with their not as yet wide hips, little butts touching, wishing to be touched. There they sat and lurched over and into bowlfuls of overspiced rice cakes and fish cakes, into paper conefuls of bandegi, roasted silkworm pupa, a perfect after-school snack for growing post-war children. The rituals. I'm thinking of the rituals, the unmemorable, the unceremonious, the unritualist of rituals. Inside the classroom, the prickly thick clouds going up my nostrils, growing like a flooding well, oozing from my lunch or some other kid's lunch, buried among all other lunch. A monument or a totem or a mass grave of aluminum lunch boxes set atop the wood-burning stove that stood in the center of our classroom universe, orbited by 70 hungry children. Didn't matter that the bottommost always burned to a crisp, a small casualty in this prized communal ritual. This is what I lived for every day, for as many days as there was homework and gym, lunch, and the sharing of lunch, and later of stories. Three, it's the woman who told stories. I'm thinking of the woman, their seasons. Each autumn, the women from the neighborhood gather to make kimchi, a slow, fermented, and deep spiced cuisine of national pride, not unlike the women who infuse them with their own arirang songs of survival. The woman would pry open the bok choy, one leaf at a time, and dab the heavily spiced concoction made of salt, garlic, ginger, shrimp, and oyster sauce onto its thick middle, where it sat saturated for days, turning in its own juices, penetrating through the layers of everyday sorrows, surviving through microbes, and come what may tribulations, long enough to last through the harsh winter. With the opening and closing of each leaf came a refrain and a lyric of a longing, that of good harvest or a husband come home. I learned about the sorrows of my people and those of my women early on. Next to my grandmother's house was a hair salon, a microcosm brimming with yet another kind of longing. This was a small, dirty room tucked away in the back of my neighbor's house, smelling of iodine and perm solution, where I spent all my lazy afternoons listening to the ladies who came to do their hair, sit around and talk, just talk. Next to the scissors, soaking in alcohol-filled jugs, like a fly stuck on the damp wall, I listened to each woman as she came in and sat in her own chair to tell her own story or a version of the same story. She, in turn, they talked about the money they didn't have. The money they didn't or would never have enough of. And if somehow they could save a little, how they would put the secret stash away somewhere their husbands wouldn't find it. They talked about the men they dreamed of murdering one day, even as they loved them, the men who beat them in front of their children, but whom they doted on anyway. If only they were gone, with the money they saved, they'd open up a little shop in the burgeoning city nearby and keep all the cash and dye their hair. They complained about the bad sex or no sex life, about their husbands' mistresses and how they wanted to murder them too. They laughed and laughed out of desperation and despair. They talked and talked about dreams and talked their way into a dream. Into the night, they talked. It's the stories. They live through stories, the stories of their own dreaming. They became the stories they told in order to survive. It's the stories their ancestors told and now they told. It's the ancestors who haunted them and now haunt me. It's the women who told stories. I listened, just listened. How are you doing on time?
We're good if you want to keep going a little bit.
Okay, I'm just gonna read one more part of a section. One. When he drank, only when he drank, my father smeared the brown goo with his bare hands all over the wall next to his bed. The smell so terrible, it'd wake everybody up. The woman. It was a house full of women, without husbands or fathers or keepers. The boorish drunk, the woman must have thought, who defied even the worst of their imagination about the war they and their mother have had to endure, and the bad men made worse by the war. Torn up by years of drinking, his weak constitution would make him go on the bed, prepared specially for him by my grandmother. When he drank, only when he drank, my father broke through a kind of barricade that he'd self-imposed between himself and the world that had become wholly unpredictable. He was enabled, albeit temporarily, to become just a little more authentically terrible than his usual, more guarded, terrible self. My father and his father and his father's father all died from an alcohol-induced liver failure in their mid-50s. While my father was alive, I saw him all of 5 or 6 times, and though I couldn't tell whether he was, in fact, intoxicated each time I saw him, he might as well have been, since he was the most sullen human to be around. He cracked a smile, not once. His face, a brown jaundiced earth with its deep grooves and cracked furrows, a once rich gorge now gone dry, would not have tolerated one. He was unpleasant and awkward around people. He was reliably capable of inducing a kind of discomfort felt deep in the bellies of people when confronted, say, with a foul-smelling wounded animal in a cage corner, inspiring at once empathy and terror. They want to help and free the hurt animal, but aren't sure whether he is safe to approach. Picture him brooding silently in an unlit corner of a room with a throng busying themselves on the other side of an imaginary fence, a thin yet impenetrable membrane he was hardly able to cross even under the influence. It may have been that he was incapable of handling all the stimuli, physical, mental, emotional, or whatever other kind, or that he simply didn't care. He'd had enough of other humans. All of this, I know to be true in my own body and mind, because I too am often capable of eliciting the same duality of unsafe emotions, of terror and empathy at once, in those within a striking distance of my anxiety-stricken state. When he drank, only when he drank, he, the wounded animal inside my father, became unleashed from his unlit corner, unafraid to toss around the gooey brown mess with his forepaws, holding it up to light in a manner shocking particularly to his woman, his preferred audience. I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for being here.